He had been flying for 30 hours and the flight attendants won't stop crying. 30 hours ago, he hopped on a red-eye flight from New York to LA to go to his favorite furry convention. Takeoff passed without incident and soon he was stretched out for a nap across the row. He didn't know how long he slept, but he woke up to some severe turbulence. He checked his phone to see that it was 4:03 a.m. When he looked out his window, he was shocked to see nothing but wide open ocean. Because obviously there's no ocean between New York and LA. He immediately hit the button to call the flight attendant. He then jumped when an attendant appeared from behind him and turned off the light. She was grinning from ear to ear, tears pouring down her cheeks. She asked, "How can I help you, sir? Where are we? Why are we flying over an ocean?" She was still grinning widely. "We'll be landing in about an hour." She left and he checked the clock on his phone again. 4:03 a.m. It hadn't changed. So he started his stopwatch app and spent the next few minutes, then hours, checking the time, waiting for it to change. It never did. His stopwatch was now telling him that he had somehow been on this plane for more than 30 hours. He had just about given up hope when a woman came down the aisle. She dropped a piece of paper onto his tray as she made her way to the bathrooms at the back of the plane. He shot a look around before unrolling it. It said, "Are you stuck too?" He then pulled out a pen and wrote, "Yes, it's been 30 hours." He folded up the scrap of paper, set it on the tray closest to the aisle. She eventually left the bathroom and picked it back up as she passed by. Hours passed before she came back down the aisle and sat in the seat beside him. She leaned over, trying to stay low. She said her name was Mary. They talked it over and realized they both were asleep at 4:03 a.m. The cabin lights then flicked off and a dozen red emergency lights on the floor flicked on, casting the cabin in a red glow. The intercom crackled to life saying, "Passengers, please return to your seats. The seatbelt sign is on and we may experience some turbulence. We'll be landing in about an hour." Mary froze. She asked, "Should I go back?" "Maybe they're just trying to separate us," he said. Mary nodded. "We should stay together." Then the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to announce the arrival of the captain. We'll all be given the opportunity to speak with him. Please remain in your seats until he calls you." 4 flight attendants then passed through the curtain and made their way down the rows towards them. Grins stretched across their faces. They were still crying, but this time the tears streaking their faces were darker. His eyes, though, weren't drawn to them. He looked over their shoulders at a figure standing near the front of the plane. It was a black silhouette standing beside the cockpit door. It was pointing towards them with a single finger. They then ran towards the back of the plane, the flight attendants closing in behind them. "The captain is here," one flight attendant said in a perfect customer service voice. They made it to the bathrooms, jumping into opposite stalls. He slammed the door shut and locked it behind him. The flight attendants began banging on the door and pulling the handle while he fought to keep it closed. "I'm sorry, but you'll both need to speak with the captain," one of the flight attendants said. Then he heard Mary scream, and a distinct snapping sound like the breaking of metal came from her bathroom. She continued to scream as the sounds of struggle migrated up towards the front of the plane towards the black figure he had seen. A few short seconds later, her screaming stopped. He hadn't heard any movement outside in hours, but he was too terrified to open the door. After another dozen hours or so, he finally opened the bathroom door. The lights in the cabin were back to normal. His mind immediately turned to Mary. What had happened to her? Where was she? He tried to make his way past his seat into first class since the flight attendants were nowhere to be seen. He saw Mary, who had a row to herself and was staring down at her phone in a window seat. He slid into the aisle seat and shook her arm. He asked, "What's going on? Are you okay?" She frowned. "Remind me, how do I know you?" It was then he realized with sinking horror that she had no idea who he was. He fought back tears. "Mary, how long have you been on this flight?" She checked the watch on her wrist. "Well, it's 4:03 a.m., so a few hours at least." He then felt an iron grip on his arm and looked up to see 2 flight attendants. "Sir, this area is for first class passengers only." They were still crying and grinning. He was then escorted back to his seat where he spent the next several days. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to get off this plane, even if it was still Airborne. He then got to his feet and limped towards the emergency exit. He grabbed the handle and swung it open. The open door now called to him, a black portal out of the plane. He stared at it for a long moment, then jumped out of the plane. The wind whipping past his face was almost magical, a new sensation after seemingly so many days, if not weeks, of torment. The ocean below grew closer and larger, and he suddenly realized he didn't want to die after all. It grew larger and larger and larger until it seemed that all he could see was darkness and waves. He impacted the surface of the water so fast and so hard, his entire body jerked around in his seat. He pulled his hand back, sucking at his bruised knuckle. He had hit it on the seat in front of him. He then shouted, "No, no, no!" A flight attendant ran down the aisle, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay, sir?" He clenched his hands into a fist, almost swinging at her. But then he realized she wasn't grinning, she wasn't crying. He quickly reached to his phone and checked the time. 4:04 a.m. "Sir, we'll be landing in about an hour." He stared unblinking at his phone. It now displayed 4:05 a.m. Then he looked out his window and began to cry at the sight of city lights below him. They did land an hour later. As he sat at the airport cafe, he couldn't even begin to understand everything that had happened. But he was free. He was out. And he was never going flying again.